The village of Umedike had seen many seasons of peace, but an unspoken dread lingered as Chief Omanuko, the oldest and most revered leader, lay on his deathbed. His compound, usually bustling, was now shrouded in an eerie stillness. The elders, heads bowed, awaited his final words. "Bury me in the sacred forest," the chief croaked, his eyes dark with an unsettling gleam. Gasps rippled through the room. The Egbudu forest was forbidden. Spirits roamed there, vengeful, lost, and hungry. "But, my chief," the high priest stammered, "no soul rests peacefully in that cursed place." A brittle laugh escaped the old man's throat. "That is my wish. Ignore it, and this village will suffer." The wind howled through the open windows as if the spirits had heard his words. Outside, thunder rumbled though the skies were clear. The elders exchanged worried glances. A chief's last wish was sacred, yet to defy tradition was to invite doom. Somewhere beyond the hut, a child wailed, high-pitched, unrelenting. It sounded too close, yet no child lived near the chief's compound. Something unseen had already begun to stir. Word spread like wildfire. The villagers muttered among themselves, torn between reverence and fear. No chief had ever been buried outside the ancestral grounds. That evening, the oldest seer, Mama Nwani, arrived at the chief's compound, her tattered cloak swaying in the wind. She knelt beside the dying man, placing a withered hand on his chest. "You do not belong there, Omanuko," she murmured. "The spirits reject you." The chief's lips curled into a weak smile. "Then let them try to keep me out." Mama Nwani flinched. "Your wish will bring only ruin." As she spoke, the flickering oil lamps dimmed. A shadow passed through the room, though no one had entered. The air turned thick, suffocating. The seer gasped, clutching her throat. Omanuko's eyes burned with defiance. "Bury me in Egbudu," he rasped. "Or prepare for a fate worse than death." The fire in the hearth extinguished itself, leaving only cold darkness. The seer fled. The next morning, the chief was dead. And the first omen arrived. When they lowered the chief's body into the shallow grave beneath the Egbudu trees, the earth rejected him. The ground trembled. The trees groaned as if whispering in protest. The sky darkened unnaturally. The priest muttered a hurried prayer, but his voice faltered. A foul stench rose from the earth, rot and decay. The diggers stepped back, horrified. "We should stop," one murmured. "No," the elder commanded. "His wish must be honored." The first shovelful of dirt hit the corpse, and a distant scream echoed from the forest depths. The grave swallowed him. But Umedike had sealed its fate. The night after the burial, Umedike did not sleep. A cold wind slithered through the village, carrying a whisper or a voice too familiar to be mistaken. "You should not have buried me here." The whisper slithered through walls, creeping into huts, curling around sleeping children. Dogs whimpered, tails tucked between their legs. The livestock, usually silent at night, let out terrified cries. At the chief's compound, his widow, Neka, tossed and turned, sweat slick on her forehead. A shadow hovered at the foot of her bed. "Omanuko," she whispered, barely able to force the name from her lips. The thing did not respond. A low, guttural sound filled the room, the deep, rattling breath not meant for the living. The fire pit in the center of the compound flared to life, casting long, flickering shadows. In that moment, she saw it. A shape, tall, gaunt, and wrapped in burial cloth, stood beneath the ancient baobab tree. Though its face was obscured, she felt its gaze boring into her soul. The widow screamed. And the village woke to the sound of distant, echoing laughter, Omanuko's laughter. But he was dead. By morning, the village was in turmoil. Some spoke of hearing their names whispered in the dark. Others swore they saw figures moving in the mist, though the dawn revealed nothing. The elders convened at the shrine of Ani, the earth goddess. Their voices trembled as they recounted the night's horrors. "This is no ordinary spirit," the priest murmured. "It does not seek peace. It seeks vengeance." Outside, the village children played by the river. One of them, little Chigazi, wandered too close to the trees. A hand, cold and bony, emerged from the shadows and brushed against his cheek. The boy froze. His tiny chest rose and fell rapidly. A voice, low and rasping, filled his ears. "Tell them. I am not at rest." Chigazi turned to run but felt something clamp around his wrist. When he screamed, the villagers came running. By the time they reached him, he was standing alone, shaking violently. His small hands were covered in something dark. Dirt. Fresh from the grave. And in the distance, the earth over Omanuko's burial mound was shifting, as if something beneath it was trying to crawl out. The elders rushed to Ebudu forest, their faces taut with fear. The morning sun did little to chase away the chill that clung to their bones. At the burial site, they found what they feared most. The earth, once packed tightly over Omanuko's grave, was now split open, as though something had clawed its way from within. The priest, Dibia Okonkwo, swallowed hard. "This is an abomination." Beside him, Elder Naji knelt and touched the disturbed soil. It was loose, soft, almost as if it had never been dug before. But there was no body. A chill ran through them. "The grave, it's empty," someone whispered. The realization settled like a stone in their stomachs. If the chief's body was missing, then what had the widow seen under the baobab tree? A rustling came from the trees. The villagers turned sharply. From the shadows of the dense forest, something watched them. Not an animal. Not a man. It did not move. It did not breathe. It just stood there. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The forest fell silent. And the elders knew Omanuko had returned. That night, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. The chief was speaking again. "You did not honor my wish." The voice slithered through the village, seeping into homes, crawling under skin and into bones. The people covered their ears, but the voice was inside their heads now. Then came the thuds, loud, rhythmic. A pounding, like fists against wooden doors. One by one, the villagers opened their doors. And they saw it. Each doorstep bore a single, bloody handprint. The priest recoiled in horror. The mark of the dead. Every home, every heart had been touched, except for one. The heart of the widow, Neka. The villagers turned as one toward her compound. Their fear now mixed with suspicion. She stood in the doorway, her face pale. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "He's waiting for me." And before anyone could stop her, she walked into the forest. The villagers watched in stunned silence as she disappeared into the darkness, toward the grave that was now empty. Toward Omanuko. The villagers hesitated before following Neka into the forest. The air was thick with unease, the towering trees whispering in a language only the spirits understood. A low hum vibrated in the air, not from insects and not from the wind. It was something else, something that sent a sharp chill through their bones. "She cannot go alone," Elder Naji muttered, gripping his walking staff. "We must bring her back." But no one moved. The forest was not theirs to walk at night. Then, suddenly, a scream tore through the darkness, Neka's voice, high-pitched, filled with terror and pain. The men ran, lanterns swinging wildly, their footsteps uneven against the twisted roots. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the path shifting, leading them in circles. And then, they found her. Neka stood in the clearing, frozen, her body rigid as stone. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her face twisted in a silent scream. The villagers followed her gaze, and saw what she saw. Omanuko was there. But he was not as he had been in life. His burial cloth was damp with grave soil, his skin grey and peeling, his fingers unnaturally long, tipped with blackened nails. And his mouth stretched wider than humanly possible. "I was not meant to die," he rasped. "But you buried me anyway." The villagers stumbled back in horror, their minds refusing to accept what stood before them. This was not their chief. This was something else, something that should have never been woken up. Omanuko, the priest whispered, stepping forward cautiously. You are dead. Your spirit should rest. Omanuko's head tilted at an unnatural angle. And yet, here I am. The trees groaned, bending as if bowing before him. The air around him shimmered, twisting with an unseen force. Then, his gaze fell on Neka. You knew, he murmured, his voice deep and guttural. Neka shook violently, tears slipping down her cheeks. I did what I had to do, she choked. You are not the man they thought you were. A ripple of confusion swept through the villagers. Omanuko's expression darkened. You betrayed me. The shadows lurched forward, swallowing Neka whole. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply disappeared. The villagers gasped, their breath fogging in the unnaturally cold air. And then Omanuko turned to them. Do you know what happens to those who bury a man where he does not belong? He asked softly. No one dared answer. His grin widened. You belong to me now. The lanterns flickered and died, plunging them into suffocating darkness. And the whispering voices grew louder. The darkness pressed against them like a living thing. The villagers clung to each other, their breathing rapid, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Then, a light. A small flicker of flame appeared, revealing Mama Nwani, the seer. She held a staff wrapped in sacred beads, her eyes glowing with ancient knowledge. You have made a terrible mistake, she whispered. Omanuko's form wavered, his body flickering between the man they once knew and the thing he had become. You are the ones who betrayed me, he hissed, his voice layered, human and something else. Mama Nwani's gaze did not waver. No, Romanuko. It was not them. It was your own wife. The villagers gasped. The wind howled as if in agreement. The seer raised her staff. Tell them the truth, O spirit of Omanuko. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Omanuko clenched his fists, his form twisting. His voice was a painful growl. She poisoned me. The revelation hit the villagers like a slap. Neka had killed her own husband. But why? The wind whispered the answer before the spirit could speak. She was not alone. Mama Nwani turned to the elders. One of you helped her. The villagers looked at one another, fear and suspicion growing between them. And Omanuko's twisted smile widened. The villagers turned to the elders, their eyes wide with fear. Who among you conspired with her? Someone whispered. The elders remained silent, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. Omanuko laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. You all stood before me and called me great leader. Yet one of you placed a serpent in my own house. Mama Nwani raised her staff higher. Spirit of the dead, you must release this village from your wrath. Omanuko's blackened nails scraped against the bark of a tree. No, he said. Not until the guilty one speaks. The villagers shrank back, some falling to their knees in prayer. The trees around them shuddered, their roots twisting as if something beneath the earth was waking. Then, Elder Naji stepped forward, his face ashen. It was me. A collective gasp. Omanuko's form snapped toward him, eyes burning. You, he whispered. The elder swallowed hard. You were cruel, Omanuko. You ruled with fear, not wisdom. The people were too afraid to act, but I gave Neka the poison. The villagers stepped away from him. You murdered your own chief, the priest said, in voice trembling. Omanuko smiled darkly. Then he will come with me. The ground beneath Elder Naji split open. Black hands reached from the soil, gripping his ankles. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the hands dragged him down. He disappeared into the earth. The ground sealed itself, leaving only a faint whisper on the wind. One debt repaid. Omanuko's body began to dissolve, his form breaking apart like ashes in the wind. His laughter faded, the curse lifting with him. The trees stopped whispering. The night grew still. The villagers stared at the ground where Naji had vanished. Was it over? Mama Nwani sighed, gripping her staff tightly. The dead have taken what they came for. No one spoke. And then, from deep within the forest, a soft, eerie laughter echoed. Faint. But still there. As if something lingered, watching. Waiting. The villagers did not return home immediately. They stood frozen in the clearing, their ears straining against the eerie silence left behind. The laughter had faded, but their unease remained. Mama Nwani drove her staff into the ground. The dead have taken their due. We must leave before the forest remembers our names. Slowly, the villagers turned back toward Yumudike. They walked in silence, their footsteps light, as if fearing the forest would reach for them. But something followed. A shadow, stretching unnaturally between the trees. Not human. Not entirely gone. Mama Nwani felt it fast. A presence brushing against her spirit, whispering in a voice not quite Omenuko's anymore. One debt repaid, oh, but not all. The old seer turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. And yet, a chill settled deep in her bones. She did not tell the others. Not yet. But she knew something had stayed behind. The village of Yumudike was never the same again. For weeks, a strange heaviness hung in the air. Though Omenuko's grave was now undisturbed, whispers still crawled through the night. The first sign of trouble came when Obina, a young hunter, went missing. His footprints led into a Budu forest, but never came out. Days later, his mother woke up screaming. Her son stood at the foot of her bed, his mouth open, his eyes hollow. But he was not there. When she blinked, he was gone. And then, one by one, the villagers began finding marks on their doors, handprints smeared in blackened dirt, much like the ones Omenuko had left before. Mama Nwani knew what it meant. The dead had not truly left. Omenuko's spirit had carried away one betrayer, but the curse had not been lifted. Something darker had taken root. Something patient. Something waiting. And then, one night, the laughter returned. Not from the trees, but from within the village itself. It was Neka's laughter that first returned to the village, echoing through the still air like a nightmare turned real. The villagers, deep in their beds, trembled in their sleep, hearts pounding as the sound grew louder. It was not the soft, sweet laughter they remembered from their chief's wife. This was something unnatural, an imitation. Mama Nwani stepped out of her hut, clutching her staff with white-knuckled fists. The air reeked of death. She knew the truth now. The curse had not been tied to Omenuko alone. When the elders buried Omenuko, they had violated a sacred law. They had not just buried a man who was wronged, they had allowed the forest itself to be disturbed. The power of the earth, of the spirits tied to it, had been torn open. And in their haste to put the chief to rest, they had ignored the dangerous rituals. They had created an opening for something much older, much darker, to awaken. And it was hungry. The night grew heavier, and the laughter echoed again, but this time, it was joined by other voices, the voices of those who had passed long ago. Mama Nwani turned to the villagers, her face grave. We must leave this land. The forest claims us all if we stay. But it was already too late. The villagers gathered at the edge of Yumudike, their faces pale, their eyes filled with dread. The once familiar forest now felt like a dark pit, alive and watching. Neka, who had been the first to betray Omenuko, had returned to haunt them. She walked among them in the form of an apparition, her eyes empty as they followed their every move. Her twisted, soulless face would appear at windows, in doorways, watching them. Then, one by one, the villagers started to disappear, just as Obina had. But their spirits did not live in peace. They stayed trapped between the world of the living and the dead. Their bodies were never found, only the marks of their passing left behind. Mama Nwani knew the truth. The curse was not over. The earth would never forget. There had been one final wish, Omenuko's wish. He had not just wanted peace for his spirit. He had wanted to be remembered, to be feared. And the village had given him that. They had violated the sacred bond, and now they would pay for their recklessness. And the true terror came when Mama Nwani turned toward the elders who had once stood by Omanuko's side. They were not the same. Their eyes were vacant, their faces warped by something unnatural. They had been claimed. They were no longer human. They had become part of the curse. The final wish, the curse of Omanuko, would never fade. The village would never be the same. The forest would continue to take, and no one would leave. And as the last of the villagers disappeared into the darkness, one final whisper filled the air, a haunting reminder of their fate.
I am not gone.